Welcome. Thank you for attending the first in the Spring Brown Bag Series, Ramsey Library Brown Bag Talks. We're very happy to be able to kick off this series with Dr. Merritt Moseley, one of our favorite professors. And here to tell you something about Dr. Moseley is Gwen Ashburn. Now, Gwen is Dean of Language, she's Dean of Humanities and in the Department of Language and Literature. So thank you, Gwen.
Thank you. I asked Dr. Moseley if I could tell you this, and he said that I could, because in July 1978, Mr. Merritt Moseley was living in Apex, North Carolina, finishing his doctorate at Chapel Hill, and he was hired to be visiting assistant professor of literature for $14,500. The next year, he must have done very well as a visiting, because then he was appointed an assistant professor of literature with a magnificent raise up to $15,800. We are glad to know after 34 years he's somewhat better paid for his many things that he's contributed to this university. And as you know, he is, of course, professor of literature and language and chair of literature and language. His personnel file in Elaine Warren's office is about this thick. So I'm not going to tell you everything he's doing. Agreements in the ground. And I must tell you that as his former chair, it was a humbling experience, because Merritt Moseley has done everything I could think of in this university, including Director of International Studies, Director of the Humanities Program, and I think he's one of the founding members of that. He is one of the founding members of the Undergraduate Research Conference. He was an exchange professor in Chester College. In 1991, he began directing the Asheville Institute on General Education, a summer institute, and did that until 1999. At which time he became director of the honors program. He was that until 2005. 2005, he was Key Center professor, did that until 2008, was then named Distinguished Professor of Humanities in 2009, and did that until 2012, and then assumed chairmanship of the Literature Department. Now, if that were not enough, in all of that time, he did and has done and continues to do amazing service. That was one of the daunting things about writing his faculty record response. I thought I had done a magnificent job naming all these things that Merritt had done one year, and he came in and said, "When you didn't even mention so-and-so," and I'm going, "Really, Merritt?" I thought I had mentioned everything in the world. But, and on top of that, such a wonderful, prolific scholar. He publishes books, he publishes articles, he gives invited keynote addresses. He told me the other day he had been invited to come to Ghent for a conference. They call him up and ask him to come, which is really a notable achievement at the professorial status. And I looked at his faculty record for last year, just to give you some sense of the fact that in service alone, he listed 10 department areas of service, 15 university ones, and 12 co-curricular activities. His list of publications was phenomenal, but I think the most impressive thing I can tell you about Merritt Moseley, if you're not already as impressed as I am, is that on those faculty records, he lists all these achievements and then tells you about 7 projects that he's thinking about starting, or that he's already starting, or that it's at the publisher. So I must tell you that I am an admirer of Merritt Moseley. I have found him always to be a wonderful scholar, a wonderful teacher, someone who gives generously to this university and community, and has been a dear friend, and most of all, the best storyteller that I have ever met. So I give you Merritt Moseley.
Generally, if I have a chance to speak to someone who's going to introduce me, I say, "Would you please keep expectations low?" And I didn't get a chance to ask Gwen to do that. I hope you'll be okay with everybody if I use notes. I've got some quotations and some titles and things that are a little hard to remember, so I'm going to use my script. Well, today I'm here to talk about academic novels, and academic novels are sometimes called campus novels or college novels or university novels. And they're not only one of the subjects about which I've done some scholarly work. I edited a book of essays about academic fiction, but a source of enormous enjoyment in my life. And I'm going to begin with some description, then some discussion of the value of these novels, and then explain why I think we should read them. And I've given most of you a bibliography I brought in case you say, I'd like to read some academic novels. What are some? I've got a list of them, but by no means a complete list. There are an infinite number of these. The academic novel goes back a long way. Well, not a long way, but at least to the 19th century. Nathaniel Hawthorne's first book, Fanshawe, was an academic novel. But he didn't get it published. Scott Fitzgerald's first novel, This Side of Paradise, was largely about being an undergraduate at Princeton. And it was based partly on a book by a man named Compton Mackenzie called Sinister Street, which was set in Oxford, as was Max Beerbohm's famous book, Zuleika Dobson. Perhaps the most familiar to Americans of these Oxford novels about dappled quads and dreaming spires is Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited, or at least the early part of that, and in its masterpiece theater version, if you haven't actually read the book, but it's about undergraduates at Oxford. All of these that I've mentioned so far are focused on the experience of students in colleges and universities. Now, there are some student-focused novels published since then, often set in less romantic institutions. Not everybody goes to Oxford, Cambridge, or Harvard, such as Kate Atkinson's Emotionally Weird, which is set at the University of Dundee, or Julian Gough's Juno and Juliet, set at University College Galway, or Hilary Mantel's, she just won the Booker Prize for the second time. She has an academic novel called An Experiment in Love, which is set at the University of London. It's not surprising, in a way, that earlier academic novels were mostly about students. After all, many people had been to college, had been college students, and like Fitzgerald, Hawthorne, and Waugh had not actually ever worked in a college. And many others who had not had the opportunity to go to college perhaps wanted to, and wanted to read about undergraduate experiences, which to them may have seemed exotic and romantic. But after the Second World War, with the enormous expansion of university education in this country and later on in the United Kingdom, and after a development in which a great many novelists, for economic reasons, actually are university professors, at least for some part of their lives, the academic novel turned its attention more to the lives of the professors. In this country, two important data points are Mary McCarthy's The Groves of Academe in 1952 and Randall Jarrell's Pictures from an Institution in 1954, both set in pretentious progressive women's colleges. Mary McCarthy, under another name, is actually a character in Jarrell's Pictures from an Institution. In England, the most important academic novel, a near contemporary of theirs, was Kingsley Amis's Lucky Jim, 1953, which was set among instructors at an undistinguished provincial university, generally conceded to be the University of Leicester. It is accurate to say that all three of these books are satires. The targets of their satire include students, the administration, the follies of progressive education, writers in residence, academic scholarship, nostalgia for the Middle Ages, lectures, and much else. And this helps to set the tone. Many academic novels are satirical, and I'm going to return to that point shortly. But first I want to mention some variations on what I think of as the mainstream of the academic novel, which is a plot focused on a professor or some professors in some kind of conflict, either with the administration, very often the case, or with their academic environment, or with their own principles, or sometimes in their love lives. First, there's a very large subgenre of academic mysteries. Very large. I don't read a lot of mysteries, but there are a lot of academic mysteries. Because a college or university is a closed community, because it is a place that tolerates a lot of eccentricity and social deviance, and because it is... David Lodge has a piece somewhere. He's written academic novels, and he quotes some person who'd had a stroke. And he was behaving in such a bizarre way, and he would come to class half-dressed and was shaving in class while he taught, and nobody said a word. He thought, why didn't somebody say I could get some help? I needed to be in a hospital. But they just thought, professors are odd. And because at least traditionally a college or university is a place devoted to reason, it makes a splendid setting for mysteries. And perhaps even more importantly, the academic murder mystery relies on the apparent antithesis, it may just be apparent, between the values of higher education like tolerance, gentleness, the settling of differences by discussion rather than violence, and the homicide at the heart of the murder mystery. In England, a well-known author of academic mysteries is Edmund Crispin, that's actually his pseudonym, his real name is Bruce Montgomery, whose sleuth Gervase Fenn is an Oxford Don, a lecturer in English, and Gaudy Night, there's several others set at Oxford. In the U.S., there are the Amanda Cross mysteries, actually by well-known scholar Carolyn Heilbrunn, former president of the Modern Language Association, who says that she chose an academic sleuth because, quote, the mind of a literary person who loves quoting, loves conversation, a comedy of manners, in short, is what appealed to me. There are also academic novels of science fiction. The best examples focused on artificial intelligence and, in effect, the human qualities of computers are Richard Powers's Galatea 2.2 and Jonathan Letham's As She Climbed Across the Table. But also exploiting the imagined properties of computing is Stephen Fry's book, Making History, which is about going back somehow and canceling the birth of Hitler. And then this is not really a genre, but there are some tragic academic novels. I don't read them with as much pleasure. The best example of this probably is MAYSARTON's book, Faithful Are the Wounds, 1955, which is based on the suicide of American scholar F.O. Matheson after his homosexuality was discovered and used against him in the McCarthy period. But most academic novels are funny, at least in part. They are comedies, they're farces, they're satires. And it is satire, among other features, that has caused some critics to wish devoutly that these books did not exist. Cambridge Don George Watson writes somewhere, I have several reasons, all partly selfish, because he's a Cambridge Don, for hoping that Anglo-American campus fiction will fade away and die. Bruce Robbins, who's written a treatment of academic fiction, refers to, quote, the generally unflattering treatment academics have received from the so-called academic novel, and says that over the past half-century or so, novelists who turned their attention to the university have arguably contributed more than a little to the acute lack of respect. We were just talking about an acute lack of respect. I don't know if our current governor reads them, but it would explain much. An understanding of which academics tend to complain. And a moral, ethical critic called David Holbrook says, surely there is something terribly wrong when in a humanities department of a university, students are introduced to works which confuse them morally, and which tend actually to endorse the false solutions of hate and barbarity. This is one of the chief embarrassments today for anyone concerned with literature and the arts. Perhaps the process came to a head with the emergence of the campus novel, not least with Lucky Jim. Lucky Jim, the main character says things like filthy Mozart, and a Mozart piece is a skein of untiring facetiousness, and so on, as many people see him as quite the Philistine. If Holbrook considers the academic novel culturally and morally dangerous, he is joined by the much younger D.J. Taylor, a critic in England, who decries what he calls the academic romp, which began to be fashionable in about the late 1960s, the campus frolic of sexual and scholastic indignity, as an example of a new relativism of the disregard for absolute standards. Now, while reading satires of higher education might give professors a shock of recognition, or perhaps even, in Janice Rawson's words, satisfaction in seeing one's enemies held up to ridicule, because we never think it's us who's being held up to ridicule, what appeal could such satires hold for non-academic readers? Some of them may derive pleasure from finding out how weak, pointless, and ineffectual the professor is. A professor, a man, a member of an ancient profession, a highly educated person, even, particularly in the past, although not in 1978, a well-paid and comfortably environed person. But how foolish and pointless people like that can be may please some people. John Lyons, also written a treatment of academic fiction, points out that even professors have a tendency to present the professor as a befuddled, chalk-covered, impotent half-man. One of the conventions of the academic novel is that the professor is sexually unimpressive. Presenting the professor this way, I think, invites the not-academic reader, who is by implication some sort of libidinous powerhouse, to enjoy an agreeable pity or contempt for this feeble pedagogue. More seriously, readers may respond to the academic satire with outrage, particularly in the past few decades when the public has been targeted by steady spray of alleged exposés of what's wrong with higher education, including Dinesh D'Souza's Illiberal Education, the Politics of Race and Sex on Campus, and Roger Kimball's Tenured Radicals, How Politics Has Corrupted Our Higher Education, and Alan Bloom's unlikely bestseller, The Closing of the American Mind, How Higher Education Has Failed Democracy and Impoverished the Souls of Today's Students, and the most damaging and This Beats Working for a Living, The Dark Secrets of a College Professor by Professor X, in our library, I believe. Members of the public may feel that the History Man or Moo is another dispatch from another Professor X, an academic mole who has decided to write a novel to let the taxpayer know that the truth is out there. The flip side of this view is the insider's anxiety, as represented by David Holbrook, a professor, a powerful believer in the moral power of university education. He says the campus novel seeks to portray the English academic at the university as a lustful fool whose values are impotent and hypocritical, and who is really driven by lust, ambition, and egotism. The effect is that the public's view of the humanities, and they're always humanities professors, or almost always, in the universities has been seriously damaged. And more important, the view held by politicians of the status of the humanities on the campus. There is no doubt that many now see us as incompetents who do not subscribe to the values we are supposed to uphold. Not the least despicable because we seem to regard the intellectual life with an air of superior disdain and ironic self-interest. In fairness, I should acknowledge that some people think academic novels are not searing and satirical enough. Adam Begley wrote an article called The Decline of the Campus Novel, in which he said that because all novelists now work for universities, they're afraid to tell the truth, that they can't really unload because they'd be damaging their own employment prospects. Yeah, I don't know whether you...
I have a whole bunch of them just waiting.
Yeah. Is there something sinister or self-lacerating about professors writing novels that to some extent, at least, hold academia and professors up for the amusement of the reader? There's been a lot of controversy over this, whether writers like David Lodge and Malcolm Bradbury, who were professors their entire adult lives and who made their careers as professors of English and as novelists of academic fiction, whether they should write novels which arguably damage the public image of English professors, students, universities, and higher learning as an undertaking. They've been damned for fouling their own nest, for displaying dirty laundry best hung inside where the laity can't get a sight of it, for biting the hand that feeds them. I think this is overly sensitive. I can enjoy the satirical exaggeration involved in the finest academic comedy without despairing of academia. There's a part of me that thrills with the recognition of the truth when I read the comment by aging, grumpy classics professor Jake Richardson in Kingsley Amos's Jake's Thing, who says, quote, "If there's one word that sums up everything that's gone wrong since the war, it's workshop." While I'm fortunate to teach in a much better institution, I can understand what's going on in Richard Russo's novel Straight Man, which is one of many subtle treatments of the steady economic privation of state universities. When Hank Devereaux, the chairman of the English department, reflects, quote, "Getting tenure in this place is like being declared the winner of a shit-eating contest." Not here. Do the books bring academia into disrepute? Well, it's possible that some readers who have hitherto admired college professors and thought higher education was a worthy and valuable way to spend time and money, having read Moo, or Straight Man, or The Mind and Body Problem, or The War Between the Tates, or Panine, or Pictures from an Institution, or The History Man, have changed their minds and begun to distrust the profession that we have chosen. I don't believe this is common. Nor, I don't believe, do professors like me who read academic novels do so because of some deep-seated self-hatred or some masochistic desire to wallow in the shortcomings of people like me who work in institutions like mine. I love this profession, and I love novels that invite me to laugh about it. I have to admit, sometimes I laugh about it without even reading a novel. As Scott Fitzgerald said, the test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. Another way of saying it would be irony. As academic novels written both by and about humanities professors, which, as I've said, are the vast majority, demonstrate, ours is the ironic profession. That may be our saving grace, increasingly. Well, why do I love to read academic novels, and why do I hope to read many more before I die? I've just ordered 3 on Interlibrary alone yesterday. I keep finding out about them more and more. First, because usually they're funny. I like to laugh. I like to be entertained, and given a choice between reading a funny book and a sad one, I will always, or almost always, choose the funny one. I remember the first time I read Lucky Jim, I laughed until I almost couldn't stand up. I've taught it in class, and I'll find myself reading something out, and I have to stop because I'm just laughing so much I can't read it. Minor side note, Lucky Jim is very, very funny. My father liked to read, and I said, you should read Lucky Jim, it's very funny. He was getting deaf, and I don't know how, but he got hold of Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad, and he read the whole thing, and he said, I didn't think it was funny at all. And I said, yeah, it's not. I mean, Lucky Jim is funny. Lord Jim, not so much. Lucky Jim, about Jim Dixon, a hapless professor. Also, I like to read academic novels because whatever we do as professors, some version of it, maybe beautiful and maybe grotesque, has been captured in a campus novel. Do we feel sorry for ourselves because our teaching load is higher than we want it to be? We should read The Search Committee by Ralph McInerney. I'm on a search committee right now too, so this comes close to home. The dean writes about the faculty. The myth was that they were all as burdened as Volga boatmen, dripping with honest sweat, criminally underpaid. Many faculty felt a romantic impulse to feel solidarity with the oppressed working classes and to fancy that their own sybaritic existence partook in some fashion of the supposed nobility of the proletariat. Have we ever gotten bogged down in an apparently unending dissertation? Possibly because of a theoretical premise that pushes back the boundaries of our project to infinity? Then we will sympathize with Camel, the graduate student in David Lodge's first academic novel, The British Museum is Falling Down, who, quote, had been doing his PhD thesis for as long as anyone could remember. Its title, Sanitation in Victorian Fiction, seemed modest enough, but as Camel would patiently explain, the absence of references to sanitation was as significant as the presence of them, and his work thus embraced the entire corpus of Victorian fiction. Do we suspect the motives of those who continue to pare away at the budgets of our universities and our departments? We may be prepared to agree with the vehement professor in Academia Nuts, one of the very best recent academic novels, by the Australian Michael Wilding. Finance was the excuse, budgetary considerations. But anyone who wanted to could see that was only an excuse. Most didn't want to. They were already so fearful, demoralized, or sycophantic, they wanted to see nothing. The climate of insecurity was having its effect, destabilizing the academics, unnerving the already pretty well nerveless. It made central control easier to impose. Tenure could not be removed without a public battle, but an inexorable process of destabilization could make the job so anxiety-ridden and unpleasant that staff would voluntarily surrender and rush into retirement. Have we ever, in a weak moment, allowed our minds to shelter the heretical thought about whether the Modern Language Association's annual meeting is a wholly good thing? I've just come from it in January, and I have sheltered this thought myself. We may discover a sneaking sympathy with the English professor in Edward Abbey's book, Mustang Sally, who reflects, why I even bother, I don't know. The only reason I go every year is that the university pays my way. This novel was published quite some time ago. And what about our teaching itself? Now, capturing what teaching is like is a difficult task for the novelist, and imagining it is hard for the legislator and member of the public as well, which may explain some of the strident demands for accountability that we hear. Not many academic novels actually devote many pages to what goes on in the classroom, unless their point is that it is boring, and these pages are almost alwast written from the student's point of view. One of the most brilliant of all academic novels, Howard Jacobson's novel, Coming from Behind, contains this mordant reflection by a disillusioned lecturer he starts off by deciding to withhold information from his students, and then he carries it the next step to giving them false information. And so he will tell them who the greatest novelists of the 19th century are, and he'll make up, namby-pamby Phillips and that sort of thing. He's teaching at a place where, in fact, budget cuts are incessant, with the result that the English department has been twinned with the local soccer team, and their offices are in the stadium. Like all small groups, he thinks, like all small groups, they met in the late afternoon when the lights were fading and spirits were wan, and the words on the page were scarcely distinguishable from the barely shaped hopes and the half-formed possibilities and the intimations and the maybes and the almosts that faintly brushed one another in the gathering shadows. Arthur Twinbarrow, one of his colleagues, who specialized in all the 20th century poets whose first or second names were Tom or Thomas, was not a small group man, but he too was able to use words like teaching and education without embarrassment, and had even been heard to speak of enriching the sensibilities of his students. The precariousness of the insecure, untenured faculty member, unsure if he'll have a job next year, is something we all know about. Some of us have been in that place, and if not, we know people who have. One of the most exquisite portrayals of a man in this plight is in a little-known book by a man named Robert Pease, I don't know how you say it, called The Associate Professor. I think it's unique in focusing not on an English professor or on a slightly displaced representative of the English professor like a historian or a classicist. Its main character, Knudsen, is a physics teacher. The novel covers a week in his life as a new administrator cracks down on unpunctual classes. Knudsen's night teaching hinders his preparing for his day classes and actually leads him to sleep through one of them. And he hectically solves homework problems on the board as fast as he can, hoping not to allow time for anyone to ask a question because he knows he won't know the answer. But someone does. And the situation, which I think will have a feeling of uncomfortable familiarity to anyone who's had a class go poorly, becomes almost Kafkaesque. This is the very end of the novel. He's putting a formula on the board and someone says it doesn't make sense. But how could he go on? The boy was right. It didn't make sense. And it would be worse after class. The boy would be around, and he'd expect Knudsen to remember his questions. What time is it? Knudsen looked nervously at a boy with thick glasses. The boy with thick glasses said nothing. From the back came, 1:40 exactly, and then almost inaudibly, 10 minutes to go. Knudsen started edging sideways towards the door. From the corridor, the voice of a middle-aged man. Yes, that's his classroom. Knudsen stopped and started edging back to the center of the table. The class was completely quiet, but they were going to laugh. He could tell. End of book. I want to include something from one of the first of the modern campus novels, one of my favorites, Lucky Jim. Jim Dixon, the main character, is on a one-year contract as a history lecturer in an undistinguished university somewhere in the north of England. And though he dislikes the medieval period, which is his specialty, he chose it because it was the easiest in his graduate school, he doesn't believe strongly in his career and isn't very good at it. He still hopes to be reappointed for the following year. He made a bad impression from the beginning. Walking across campus, he idly kicked a stone and it flew over and hit the vice chancellor in the knee and almost crippled him. Much of his time is spent trying to impress his professor, a pompous nonentity called Welch. Here he is thinking about the special subject he is preparing to teach. Clearly, the more students, within reason, Dixon could get interested in his subject, the better for him. Equally clearly, too large a number of interested students would mean that the number studying Welch's own special subject would fall to a degree that Welch might be expected to resent. 3 students seemed a safe number to try for. So far, Dixon's efforts on behalf of his special subject, apart from thinking about how much he hated it, have been confined to aiming to secure for it the 3 prettiest girls in the class, one of whom was Mitchie's girl, while excluding from it Mitchie himself. Mitchie is a guy who knows more about medieval history than he does, and so he's terrified to have him in the class. And here he's being forced to discuss the article he's written, since Welch has told him that getting an article accepted will help him secure his employment. Eventually it's stolen and published in Spanish in an Argentinian journal under somebody else's name. Welch has asked him for the title, and Jim reflects. It was a perfect title in that it crystallized the article's niggling mindlessness. its funereal parade of yawn-enforcing facts, the pseudo-light it threw on non-problems. Dixon had read or begun to read dozens like it, but his own seemed worse than most in its air of being convinced of its own usefulness and significance. In considering this strangely neglected topic, it began. This what neglected topic? This strangely what topic? This strangely neglected what? His thinking all this without having defiled and set fire to the typescript only made him appear to himself as more of a hypocrite and fool. Let's see, he echoed Welch in a pretended effort of memory. Oh yes, the economic influence of the developments in shipbuilding techniques, 1450 to 1485. Let me close with one of my favorite academic novels, which is A.S. Byatt's Possession, a wonderful, wonderful book that won the Man Booker Prize in 1980, I think. 1990, maybe. Possibly the fullest and richest modern academic novel that I know. There's plenty of satire on scholarship, competition for fame and grants, research that is driven by grimly held theory, academic hierarchies, a lot of satire on American academics because it's an English novel, and once again, precarious instructors. But there is throughout a feeling for the professor's calling that I think is deeply moving. If teaching is hard to make into good fiction, then how much harder is reading? But hear what Byatt has to say about this activity, so central to all our lives. She writes, "It is possible for a writer to make, or remake, at least, for a reader, the primary pleasures of eating, or drinking, or looking on, or sex. Novels have their obligatory tour de force, the green-flecked gold omelette au fin herbe, melting into buttery formlessness and tasting of summer, or the creamy human haunch, firm and warm, curved back to reveal a hot hollow, the glimpsed sex. They do not habitually elaborate on the equally intense pleasure of reading. There are obvious reasons for this, the most obvious being the regressive nature of the pleasure, a mise en abîme even, where words draw attention to the power and delight of words, and so ad infinitum, thus making the imagination experience something papery and dry, narcissistic and yet disagreeably distanced, without the immediacy of sexual activity or the scented garnet glow of good Burgundy. And yet natures such as Roland's," he's a graduate student, "natures such as Roland's are at their most alert and heady when reading is violently yet steadily alive." I guess I'm like Roland. My nature is at its most alert and heady when reading is violently yet steadily alive too. And books about the university, with their combination of wisdom, learning lightly held, insights into human nature, recognizable situations of the academic life, and bright and sparkling comedy, are what I like to read, and I hope you will too. So I'd be happy to take any questions or comments. And I've got a bibliography, but maybe everybody got one.
So Lucky Jim, we know, is one of your all-time favorites. And you refer to James Smiley's movie.
Wonderful book.
Wonderful book. And then what else?
Straight Man.
Straight Man. Russo.
Yeah, Richard Russo's Straight Man. The central situation, well, it has a lot of situation, but the central situation is that they can't get a budget from the legislature. And so in front of TV cameras, he seizes a duck from the campus pond and says, "I'm going to kill a duck every day until we get a budget." He doesn't, but and it's there are a lot. I mean, I like some that are postmodern. There's one called Book, a Novel, by a man named Gruden, Howard Gruden, and it's about an academic setting, but it gets very complicated. The footnotes set up a rebellion against the rest of the book and that sort of thing. And one called The Occupation by David Coate, or Coate, I think it's pronounced C-A-U-T-E, another good book. I like, there are a lot of them about sexual and misbehavior or entanglements, including Professor Romeo by Anne Bernays and Blue Angel by Francine Prose. Those are good. Mustang Sally is like that. He gets fired. Or The War Between the Tates by Allison, what's her name? What else? I don't know.
Something like Love Story. I mean, is that because it takes place on the campus? Does that?
That's to me. That's a campus fiction. Okay. Yeah, it's about students. I haven't read as many of the student ones. Right. I mean, Donna Tartt, The Secret History, is about students. There are a lot of them that are about students. I don't read as many of those.
But they fall within that.
Oh, I think so. Some people would say there's an academic novel and there's a campus novel or campus fiction, and they would say the campus is mostly about students. That doesn't make as much sense to me because outside of the United States, most universities don't have a campus. You know, campus is an American term. They don't really have a campus at a place like the University of Manchester or Liverpool or somewhere like that. So they're college novels, but not campus novels. I think David Lodge's novels are wonderful. And one of my favorites is Small World, an academic romance, which begins with a wonderful passage that says something like this. Going to academic conferences is something like going on a medieval pilgrimage. You get to go somewhere interesting and meet people while pretending to remain austerely bent upon self-improvement. That's a wonderful. I mean, I became interested in Lodge partly because I did an academic exchange in the same year that I became aware of his novel, Changing Places, which is about an academic exchange between a kind of a obscure English drip named Philip Swallow and an American, high-powered American who's clearly based on Stanley Fish called Morris Zapp. And he goes and teaches at the University of Rummidge, which is Birmingham, and Philip Swallow goes and teaches at the University of Euphoria, which is Berkeley, and gets involved in the People's Park, and they end up swapping wives, and I've forgotten what else. But anyway, there's some very funny stuff in there. One of my favorites is that Philip Swallow, who's from a different culture, and he teaches to the Americans a game they like to play in England, and I've forgotten what it's called, but English professors, each of them has to name a book that he should have read but hasn't. The one who names who sort of abases himself most wins. But one man who's the Shakespeare specialist admits he's never read Hamlet. And then he's fired. And so later on you meet him, he's teaching at Iowa State or somewhere like that in one of the later books. Morris Zapp is one of these imperious men who wants to write everything there is to write about Jane Austen and basically put an end to Jane Austen criticism because it will all have been written. And then he's going to turn his attention to somebody else. And so, there's a kind of a contrast between American brashness and English modesty. And Stepping Westward by Malcolm Bradbury. Stepping Westward is also about an Englishman who comes and teaches in the United States. His first book is very good. It's called Eating People is Wrong. And then he has one called The History Man, which is set in, I think, the early 70s, and it's really kind of about radicalism on a new English university and a rapacious, manipulative professor. And then it was made into a TV show. And some people do think that didn't help the taxpayer support of the university system very much. Yes, sir.
As a young reader of novels, I was introduced to the campus by reading sports fiction. And I probably the last thing I read was My Losing Season with Pat Conroy, where it's not fiction, but it's a campus. Well, it is a bit of fiction. I hope.
I think so too.
And I wonder, is there a subgenre that is sort of an academic athletic?
I suspect there is, but I haven't read very much there. I did read one called Dink Stover at Yale, I think, and that's about 1898 or something, and he played football, and it's all about the football team. One of the things that's interesting about it is football in those days was, you can tell it's just the same thing as rugby. The team that scored gets to receive the ensuing kickoff. There's no forward passing, that sort of thing. But I think there probably is a genre. I just don't know it.
May I introduce Dr. Alvis Dunn, who is a visiting professor of history. He happens to be sitting next to the university librarian, but Dr. Dunn comes to us from Guilford.
Oh.
He's chair of the history department and might recognize himself in some of those historian
Yeah.
professors.
As I said, I think most of the time, if you read about somebody who's a historian or a classicist, that's because the English professor and novelist who wrote it doesn't want to make him an English professor. They just decided to make him something else. I just don't think they'll.
Why do the humanities folks get such a bad rub here?
Well, I mean, I think partly because the people who write them are humanities folks. I mean, I don't think there are that many chemists writing novels, and if they did, maybe they'd write about chemistry. I don't know what the guy who wrote the book about Knudsen, the physics professor, what he was. I know nothing about him, but that interests me because it is a professor, a physics professor. And there's another subgenre that, about administrators, about college presidents. There's a crazy one written by a husband. Sorry? There's a considerable overlap. One called The Man Who Stole a University. And you think, well, that doesn't sound good. Oh, no, it's very admiring about somebody that got exasperated with the university, and he moved it all to an unused military base and hired all new people to teach it. And what a wonderful thing that's supposed to have been. But you know, most of them are not. Some of the early ones, like Pictures from an Institution by Randall Jarrell, is a lot of that's about the college president, about his. At one point he says he was so well adjusted to his environment that you couldn't tell where he left off and his environment began.
Did you read at Greensboro when that was published?
No, I don't think he was. He went to Greensboro about 1960, I think. This was 1954. He was teaching at Sarah Lawrence or somewhere like that.
So with the Mary McCarthy's that you mentioned the title, but would you also think of the group as?
Yeah, very much so.
Is that the campus novel, or is that?
Well, see, most of them, particularly if they're student focused, are not always at the campus. I mean, the group is sort of looking back on a group of girls that got together when they were students together.
Yeah.
And you know, This Side of Paradise doesn't remain at the campus. Most of them, there's a segment which is set among college students. Then they go on and do something else. The Longest Journey by E.M. Forster has a section at Cambridge, but then they go on and do something else. So I don't know what percentage of it has to be on campus before you call it a campus novel, but I think of them as campus novels.
You look through the list, I see lots of names I recognize, but not for these books. In other words, these titles would not be considered the cream of the crop, nor the top, I think, for most of these authors.
Like who?
Oh, I'm thinking Burgess.
No, that's not one of his best.
Bellows.
No, that's his next to last completed novel, and it's pretty poor.
What I'm wondering is, Nabokov's.
Nabokov, Penin and Pale Fire, those are wonderful books.
Now I'm thinking, a lot of these are what you call, I don't think of someone like you, not a literature professor,
Yeah.
comes across literature very rarely to the campus, or are they focused there? I wonder, is that because the setting just doesn't contribute to good story development, good character development?
Well, of course, I
Is it a lousy setting?
think it does, and I would point out that I haven't got them all on there, but Philip Roth, The Human Stain, and two of his early novels were campus novels. James Coetzee, Nobel Prize winner, Disgrace, that's a campus novel. It's unusual when it's somebody like Lodge or Bradbury who keep writing campus novels, but most people have written one. Alison Lurie's written 2 or 3.
Where, usually early in their career or later?
Well, I mean, Roth, very near the end of his career. Human Stain was...
But I'm wondering most of these others.
Well, and Burgess's Enderby is fairly late in his life, and he wrote another one about Enderby as well. That was when he got famous enough that he was brought to Columbia as a visiting professor. And that's the experience on which he based it. And he was there when the students took over the library at Columbia, and he didn't like that very much. And he wrote 3 about Enderby, I think, a trilogy. No.
So is this journey you're on with academic novels somewhat like the dissertation student in the sanitation in Victorian England? I mean, good scholarship says pick somebody that's dead and that's not going to keep writing.
Well, I don't think I'll ever write anything more about him, probably. I mean, I just read him for fun. Now, I am going to do that talk, I hope. I haven't quite gotten that confirmed, in Ghent in May. And my topic...
That's on academic novels.
Yeah, my title of my abstract is The Academic Novel as Ironic Faculty Handbook. And I'm taking a few little nuggets and I'm altering a little bit from UNCA's Faculty Handbook about
Going a long ways away.
amorous relations and dedication to teaching and so on, and then going to use those as a glimpse into what we find out by reading the academic novel.
Maybe we could workshop them.
I might do that. I say that a lot. I find myself more and more the older I get saying, if there's one word that sums up everything that went wrong after the war, it's workshop. unless it's
Creative.
unless it's mission statement. But
Does Look Homeward Angel count?
yeah, sure.
So does it say something about, I've never read Oh Lost, but I've attended a workshop now. I heard it talk about Oh Lost, and supposedly, Oh Lost is includes all the pages that the publisher required to be taken out of Look Homeward Angel, and most of those pages are campus focused.
Gwen probably knows more about that than I do.
I've
Huh?
never read O Lost either.
I've looked at it, it's very large.
Yeah.
Well, Wolf brought his manuscript in a milk crate, and then his editor would have to cut 9/10 of it, I guess, to get it down to even a long novel.
That's mostly Chapel Hill that ends up on
Yeah, yeah.
Or Pulpit.
I mean, again, it's not all, but I mean, it starts before he goes to Chapel Hill, and I think actually he's left there by the time it's over. So that's what the undergraduate, one of the odd features about college is you've got a fluid group of undergraduates and a stable group of faculty members. We don't go anywhere, and they come and stay for a while, then they go. Something like DeLillo's White Noise is very much about this. And so the undergraduate novel, I mentioned Emotionally Weird. That takes place for just a few days at a university. All this got flashbacks and flash forwards. But most of them, there's a time, and then they go off and do something else. So they're not purely stuck on the campus. There are some that are one thing that I think authors find attractive about academic novels is the time scale and the time scheme, because they have semesters, or they have quarters, or they have classes that are 50 minutes long, or something like that. And in England, they'll often use something like May Week, if they want to have a novel that just lasts a week, or Exam Week, or something like that. And White Noise is very much uses the return of the students, the days of the station wagons, as he calls it, when the students come back. So, but I think undergraduate novels are more likely to use it only as a segment. Or maybe even something in the past, like The Secret History, I think, is about looking backward at something awful that happened when they were undergraduates. And Bret Easton Ellis has written one, and The Art of Fielding, which is a novel that came out last year or the year before, that's set at a university college, and it's about sports. Do you know that one? The Art of Fielding, it's about baseball.
Yeah, we were just on Lee Smith's The Last Girls.
Last
They look
Girls.
back at that college experience as they float down the river with the ashes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the thing is, I feel like Tristram Shandy, who's trying to write his biography, but he keeps falling behind because he wants to tell everything. I mean, I'm fully aware I'm going to fall behind on reading academic novels, but I'm most fully alive when I'm reading, so might as well try. Leah?
When I think of these campus novels written from the student perspective, I often think of the ones that are kind of nostalgic and, have that sort of glow about them of those halcyon days. But then there's the ones like I Am Charlotte Simmons. I don't know if you read that. They're just skating, and I don't know, is there a subclass of those? I read that one, and that's the only one I think I've read that was.
I think that's a little unusual in being, I don't think it's a very good book. I mean, it's mostly Tom Wolfe's cry of anger against the way things are going in the modern world. And modern sexual mores and things like that. I think there are some. I mean, some of them are about not being well treated by your professor, not getting a very good education, being asked to do pointless things. Yeah, there are some. Having a nervous breakdown. There are some of those. I don't know the student subgenre as well as I do the professor subgenre.
And normalcy doesn't make nearly as good a reading.
What?
What normalcy?
No, I mean, what is it? I mean, Sen will tell you, happiness writes white. Isn't that what you say in your fiction workshop? Happiness writes white. So if you wrote a book about somebody that started as a freshman and made good grades, like Megan over here, and graduated in 4 years, who would want to read it? 5? Well, getting there. Who wants to read that? You don't want to read about people who are having trouble. So I think somebody else, Robertson Davies has a number of them. The Rebel Angels, and I've forgotten what else. Set at the University of Toronto.
Even as you're talking, just the books the stories that I can remember, and how many actually have these attributes that are just, even Rousseau's latest, I think it's The Cape. is a sort of a look back nostalgically of his parents who were professors, and it also has all these.
And Francis the Corrections.
Yeah, right.
I mean, there's a, and I think that's partly because so many people have been to college and know something about it. Now, Gore Vidal, who was a scathing critic as well as a novelist, used to decry all this because he said it's novelists who teach in colleges who write books to be read by students who go to college, that it's very incestuous and inward looking, and he called it he liked to describe fiction as being divided into two kinds, R&R and R&D. R&R is rest and recreation, and R&D is research and development. And he thought that the academic novel was an R&D novel, meant to be written in order to be taught in an English class, and of no interest to anybody else. But I don't think that's true. Hope not too. A lot of people like to write them. Anything else?
I have to go teach a creative.
Me, I got to go teach too.